The world rarely mistakes talent for long, it only mistakes the people who carry it. The polished glass walls of Hawthorne Performance Motors reflected rows of exotic cars worth more than most families would earn in a lifetime. Customers wandered through the immaculate showroom with coffee cups in hand while sales consultants spoke confidently about horsepower, craftsmanship, and exclusivity. Every vehicle gleamed beneath carefully positioned lights until the quiet rumble of an aging pickup echoed across the parking lot. Daniel Carter slowly pulled into the visitors section before switching off the engine. The faded red truck had more than 200,000 miles on the odometer, chipped paint along both doors, and years of honest work written into every scratch across its body. Daniel stepped out wearing worn denim jeans, oil-stained work boots, and a dark work shirt with the embroidered name of his small neighborhood repair shop stitched above the pocket. He looked toward the dealership entrance, reached into the truck bed, and carefully lifted a heavy wooden crate before carrying it with both hands. A young valet noticed him immediately and exchanged an amused glance with another employee. "Service entrance is around back," he called with a polite smile that carried more judgment than kindness. Daniel stopped. "I am here to pick up a specialty bearing I ordered last week." The valet looked him up and down before nodding toward the showroom. "You might feel more comfortable at the parts counter behind the building." Daniel simply thanked him and continued walking without changing his pace. Inside the showroom, conversations briefly paused as customers noticed the mechanic carrying the weathered crate through a room filled with polished marble floors and luxury automobiles. One salesman quietly whispered to another, and both smiled before returning to their clients. Daniel ignored every glance. He had spent enough years repairing engines to know that appearances often made people careless. He reached the reception desk and politely gave his name. The receptionist searched the computer before smiling professionally. "Your part is almost ready." "It should only take a few minutes." Daniel nodded with appreciation. "Thank you." With nothing else to do, he quietly walked toward the display area, careful not to touch a single vehicle. A brand-new performance coupe rested on a rotating platform while several customers admired its flawless finish. Daniel never looked at the paint. Instead, he listened. Somewhere beneath the music playing softly through the showroom speakers, a technician started the coupe's engine inside a nearby service bay for a final inspection before delivery. Daniel's eyes lifted almost immediately. His expression did not change, but he remained completely still, listening as the engine idled for only a few seconds before shutting down again. Most people heard nothing unusual. Daniel heard something else entirely. A barely noticeable metallic rhythm appeared once every few revolutions before disappearing again. He quietly turned his head toward the service doors. A salesman noticed his attention and smiled with quiet amusement. "Beautiful sound, is it not?" Daniel answered honestly. "It is a beautiful engine." He paused briefly. "But something is not quite right." The salesman laughed softly. "That car was inspected by factory-certified technicians this morning." Another customer folded his arms with a grin. "Funny how the only person hearing a problem happens to be wearing work boots." A few nearby guests smiled politely. Daniel never reacted. He simply looked once more toward the closed service doors, as though listening to a conversation nobody else in the building could hear. Without another word, he rested the wooden crate beside his boots and patiently waited, while somewhere beyond the polished walls, a machine quietly revealed the first clue that only one mechanic in the room was able to understand. Daniel Carter remained exactly where he was, his attention fixed on the closed service bay doors while everyone else returned to admiring polished paint and luxurious interiors. The brief sound of the performance engine lingered in his mind. It had lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried a pattern that experience had taught him never to ignore. The metallic rhythm had not been loud enough for an ordinary driver to notice. It was almost hidden beneath the smooth exhaust note. Almost. Daniel quietly glanced toward the reception desk to see whether his replacement bearing had arrived, but the receptionist was still speaking with another customer. He had nothing to do except wait. A service technician suddenly drove the silver performance coupe out of the workshop and parked it near the showroom entrance for its final customer inspection. Several sales consultants gathered around the vehicle with confident smiles while photographers prepared promotional pictures. Daniel watched the engine idle from across the room. His expression remained calm. The same faint irregular sound returned once every few moments before disappearing again. It was so subtle that the surrounding conversations nearly covered it completely. One customer admired the car with obvious excitement. "It sounds perfect." Daniel quietly answered without raising his voice. "It sounds impressive, but I would not deliver it yet." The nearby salesman slowly turned toward him. "Excuse me?" Daniel nodded politely. "There is a small mechanical inconsistency. It is probably beginning near the front accessory drive or one of the rotating assemblies." The salesman gave a short laugh before looking toward his coworkers. "Our technicians spend years training on these cars." Another employee folded his arms. "And you diagnosed it from 20 feet away?" Several customers smiled politely. One older gentleman shook his head with quiet amusement. "Confidence is free these days." Daniel never appeared offended. "I could be wrong," he said calmly. "That is always possible. I only believe the car deserves another careful inspection before it leaves the building." His respectful tone somehow made the room even quieter. There was no arrogance in his voice. No attempt to impress anyone. Only quiet certainty. A service manager named Rebecca Lawson overheard the conversation while reviewing paperwork nearby. She walked over with measured professionalism. "Sir, I understand you have concerns about one of our vehicles." Daniel met her eyes respectfully. "Only a suggestion." Rebecca looked toward the coupe. "Our diagnostic equipment found nothing unusual this morning." Daniel nodded. "Computers are excellent at measuring what their sensors are designed to detect." He paused briefly before continuing. "Experienced ears sometimes notice what sensors have not recognized yet." Rebecca studied him for a moment. His clothes were stained from years of honest work, but his manner was calm, precise, and completely free of exaggeration. Before she could respond, one of the dealership technicians stepped forward with a confident smile. "Would you like to tell us exactly what you think is wrong?" Daniel shook his head gently. "Not until I hear it one more time." The technician handed the keys to a coworker. "Start it again." The engine came to life, filling the showroom with a deep, refined sound that drew admiring looks from nearly everyone nearby. Daniel slowly closed his eyes for only a few seconds, listening instead of watching. When the engine settled into a smooth idle, he opened them again. "There it is," he said quietly. "The sound arrives only after the oil pressure stabilizes." Several technicians exchanged puzzled glances. Daniel looked toward the service manager with the same calm expression he had worn since entering the dealership. "If you allow that engine to leave today without checking one specific component, someone will eventually hear that same sound under much worse circumstances." The laughter that had filled the showroom only minutes earlier began giving way to something far less comfortable. Curiosity. Rebecca Lawson looked from Daniel Carter to the silver performance coupe, then toward her lead technician. The entire showroom had grown noticeably quieter. Customers who had been discussing leather interiors and paint colors now watched a different kind of demonstration unfold. Rebecca folded her clipboard beneath one arm before speaking. "You have exactly 2 minutes. Tell us what you believe you are hearing." Daniel nodded politely. "Thank you." He did not walk toward the engine immediately. Instead, he stood several feet away, listening as the vehicle continued idling. He slowly circled the front of the car without touching it, his eyes focused not on the polished bodywork but on the subtle rhythm hidden beneath the smooth exhaust note. The technicians exchanged uncertain looks. One whispered quietly, "What is he doing?" Another answered with a shrug. trying to impress everyone. Daniel finally stopped near the front passenger side fender. He rested 2 fingers lightly against the metal above the wheel arch for only a moment before stepping back again. "Would you raise the engine speed to about 2,000 revolutions per minute?" The technician inside the car did exactly that. The engine responded instantly with a clean, powerful tone. Daniel listened carefully until the speed returned to idle. He smiled faintly. "Thank you." Rebecca crossed her arms. "Well?" Daniel looked toward her calmly. "The problem is not inside the engine block." One technician smiled confidently. "We already knew that." Daniel nodded. "I believe you did. The sound is too regular for internal damage." The technician's smile faded slightly. Daniel continued in the same quiet voice. "It also is not the transmission, because the rhythm remains identical regardless of load." Several technicians looked at one another. Nobody interrupted. Daniel pointed gently toward the front of the engine compartment without touching the vehicle. "The inconsistency appears only after oil pressure reaches operating range. My first inspection would focus on the front accessory drive, beginning with the belt tension system and the adjacent rotating components. One bearing is beginning to fail under temperature, but only after lubrication reaches normal pressure." One of the senior technicians frowned. "You cannot know that without opening it." Daniel answered respectfully. "I do not know. I believe it is the most logical place to begin." Rebecca looked toward her lead technician. "Can we check it?" The technician hesitated. "It will take 15 minutes. Before anyone could respond, another employee walked over carrying a diagnostic tablet. "The computer reported no faults this morning." Daniel smiled politely. "I did not expect it would." The employee looked confused. Daniel continued, "Some mechanical problems begin long before electronic systems recognize them." The room became noticeably quieter. Customers who had been smiling only minutes earlier now watched Daniel with growing curiosity instead of amusement. Rebecca finally nodded. "Open the front." The hood rose smoothly, revealing an engine that looked almost too perfect to have any flaw at all. 2 technicians immediately connected diagnostic equipment while another removed protective covers to inspect the accessory drive. Daniel stepped back without offering another opinion. He simply waited. Several long minutes passed. Then one technician suddenly leaned closer with a flashlight. His confident expression slowly disappeared. "Rebecca," he called quietly. "You should probably see this." She walked over immediately. The technician rotated one pulley by hand before stopping. A barely noticeable roughness could now be felt through the bearing housing. It was almost impossible to detect without deliberately searching for it. Rebecca looked back toward Daniel, surprised. "That bearing was beginning to fail?" Daniel nodded once. "It still has some life left. But not enough for a customer who expects perfection." None of the technicians laughed this time. Instead, every eye in the showroom shifted toward the quiet mechanic standing beside the worn wooden crate he had carried into the dealership, wondering how a man they had dismissed within seconds had heard what an entire luxury service department had overlooked. Rebecca Lawson slowly lowered the hood after the faulty bearing had been identified, and for several moments the showroom remained unusually quiet. The polished luxury dealership suddenly felt less like a place built around expensive automobiles and more like a classroom where everyone had realized they had overlooked the simplest lesson. Daniel Carter stood exactly where he had been since the beginning, one hand resting lightly on the worn wooden crate beside him. He showed no sign of satisfaction, no smile of victory, and no desire to remind anyone what had happened. Rebecca walked toward him with a thoughtful expression. "You were right," she admitted. "That problem was real." Daniel nodded politely. "I am glad it was found before the customer drove away." One of the younger technicians stepped closer, still studying Daniel with disbelief. How many years have you been working on these engines? Daniel shook his head gently. I have never worked on this model. The technician blinked. Then how did you know? Daniel looked briefly toward the performance coupe before answering. Machines follow patterns. The badge on the hood changes. The physics do not. Several employees quietly exchanged glances. His answer was simple, yet none of them could disagree with it. The receptionist soon returned carrying a small package. Mr. Carter, your specialty bearing finally arrived. Daniel smiled warmly. Thank you. He accepted the small box and placed it carefully inside the wooden crate without another word. The crate itself immediately caught the attention of one curious technician. It had remained beside Daniel throughout the entire conversation, yet nobody had asked about it until now. That looks heavy, the technician said. Daniel nodded. It is. Replacement parts? Daniel answered honestly. Something I have been working on for several years. Before anyone could ask another question, a delivery driver entered the showroom pushing a cart loaded with shipping containers. One large crate accidentally brushed against Daniel's wooden box, causing the lid to shift open by only a few inches. Daniel instinctively reached forward to steady it before anything inside could move. For just a brief moment, everyone nearby caught sight of precisely machined aluminum components resting inside custom wooden supports. The polished metal surfaces reflected the showroom lights with extraordinary precision. Every edge looked hand-finished. Every component appeared unlike ordinary replacement parts. The technician standing closest frowned slightly. Did you build those? Daniel looked down at the open crate before quietly closing the lid again. Yes. For what kind of engine? Daniel smiled faintly. My own. The answer seemed almost too simple. Another employee laughed softly, assuming it was an ambitious hobby project. Planning to compete with the manufacturers? Daniel shook his head. No. I only wanted to see whether I could build something better than what I imagined. His voice carried no arrogance. Only quiet honesty. Rebecca found herself looking at the wooden crate differently now. The machining marks she had glimpsed were remarkably clean, almost artistic in their precision. Before she could ask another question, movement near the main entrance drew everyone's attention. Conversations throughout the showroom gradually faded as several senior executives unexpectedly entered the building alongside security personnel and corporate representatives. Employees immediately straightened their posture. Sales consultants quietly stepped aside. Even the technicians stopped working. Rebecca looked toward the entrance with surprise before whispering to one of her coworkers. Nobody told me he was visiting today. The coworker answered under his breath. Neither did anyone else. Daniel simply picked up his wooden crate and prepared to leave, completely unaware that the distinguished man walking calmly through the showroom had spent an entire lifetime designing engines. As the visitor passed the line of display vehicles, his attention never settled on the polished supercars surrounding him. Instead, his eyes unexpectedly stopped on the weathered wooden crate in the quiet mechanic's hands, and for the very first time that afternoon, his measured pace came to a complete stop. The distinguished visitor stopped beside Daniel Carter without saying a single word. Every employee in the showroom immediately recognized him. William Hawthorne, the founder whose name stood above the dealership entrance, rarely visited individual locations anymore. His reputation had been built long before luxury showrooms and international recognition. He had spent decades designing engines with his own hands before ever leading a company. Daniel, however, did not recognize him immediately. He simply shifted the weight of the wooden crate into a more comfortable position and stepped slightly aside to clear the walkway. William did not continue walking. His attention remained fixed on the precisely machined aluminum component barely visible beneath the edge of the crate's lid. He looked at it for several quiet seconds before speaking. "May I ask you something?" Daniel nodded politely. "Of course." William pointed gently toward the crate. "Did you machine those components yourself?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Yes." William studied his face for a moment. "Every one of them?" "Every one." The founder's expression changed almost imperceptibly. He had spent a lifetime examining engines, and certain details could not be mistaken by anyone with enough experience. The machining marks visible along one exposed housing were perfectly consistent. The finishing pattern suggested hundreds of hours of careful hand-fitting rather than automated mass production. William looked toward Rebecca Lawson. "Would you mind if he opened the crate?" Rebecca immediately stepped aside. "Certainly." Daniel placed the wooden crate carefully on the polished showroom floor before releasing the brass latches. He lifted the lid slowly, revealing a collection of beautifully organized engine components resting inside custom-cut wooden supports. There were cylinder heads, intake pieces, precision brackets, and a partially assembled block unlike anything displayed inside the dealership. The entire showroom grew noticeably quieter. One technician whispered under his breath, "He really built all of that." William knelt beside the crate instead of remaining standing. He never reached for the parts immediately. Instead, he simply observed them with complete concentration. His eyes moved from one surface to another, following tiny machining details invisible to almost everyone else. Finally he looked at Daniel again. "How long?" Daniel answered honestly. "Almost 6 years." William nodded slowly. "Working after hours?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Most nights. Most weekends." The founder carefully lifted one small machined component with both hands, examining the internal surfaces beneath the bright showroom lights. He turned it once before quietly exhaling. "This oil passage was redesigned." Daniel nodded. The original flow created unnecessary turbulence under sustained load. Several dealership technicians looked at one another in surprise. William continued examining the piece. "You also reduced rotating mass without weakening the housing." Daniel gave another small nod. "That was the goal." The founder looked almost amused. "Very few people would even notice that." Daniel answered calmly. "The engine notices." For the first time since entering the building, William smiled openly. He returned the component to its exact position before slowly closing the crate himself. Then he stood and looked around the silent showroom where employees and customers waited for him to speak. "Do you know what you are looking at?" he asked the technicians. Nobody answered. William rested one hand lightly on the closed crate. "This is not someone's hobby project." He paused, allowing every word to settle across the room. "This is the work of a master engine builder." Complete silence followed. The same people who had quietly laughed at Daniel's work boots only an hour earlier now found themselves looking at the quiet mechanic with entirely different eyes. William turned back toward Daniel with genuine respect. "I would like to see the complete engine." Daniel hesitated for only a moment before answering. "It is still in the back of my pickup." William smiled once more. "Then I believe the most important vehicle in this dealership today is not inside the showroom." William Hawthorne walked with Daniel Carter toward the parking lot without another word. Employees, technicians, and customers quietly followed several steps behind, curiosity replacing every trace of the confidence that had filled the showroom earlier. The faded red pickup sat alone beneath the afternoon sun, surrounded by vehicles whose price tags measured success in dollars instead of craftsmanship. Daniel unlocked the tailgate and carefully removed a heavy protective canvas that covered a steel engine stand secured inside the truck bed. As the fabric folded away, the entire group fell silent. Resting before them was a complete hand-built performance engine finished in natural aluminum with precisely machined surfaces that reflected light without unnecessary polish. Nothing about it appeared decorative. Every bracket, every housing, every fastener existed for a purpose. William stepped closer but did not touch it. He slowly circled the engine once, studying every angle with the patient concentration of someone reading a familiar language. Daniel remained beside the truck, allowing the engine to speak for itself. One technician quietly whispered, "That does not look homemade." Another answered almost immediately, "It looks better than homemade." William finally stopped beside the front timing cover. He smiled faintly before pointing toward a small machine detail hidden beneath one mounting bracket. Nobody would spend hours machining this surface unless they understood exactly why it mattered. Daniel nodded once. The oil passage behind it needed more consistent pressure during extended operation. William looked at him with growing respect. "You solved the cavitation problem without increasing internal resistance." Daniel answered calmly. "I tried several designs before that one worked." Rebecca Lawson watched the conversation with genuine amazement. The technical discussion unfolding before her no longer sounded like a customer speaking with a company founder. It sounded like two engineers exchanging ideas after years of solving the same problems. William continued examining the engine, occasionally stopping to admire tiny details invisible to everyone else. "You balanced the rotating assembly yourself." Daniel smiled slightly. "Twice. And these intake runners were shaped by hand." "Yes." "No computer optimization?" Daniel shook his head. "Only careful testing." William quietly laughed to himself. That explains why they look like they belong together instead of looking identical. Several technicians exchanged puzzled expressions. William noticed immediately. "Mass production creates identical parts," he explained without taking his eyes off the engine. "Master craftsmen create parts that work together." The word settled across the silent parking lot. One senior technician slowly stepped forward. "Sir, are you saying this engine could actually compete with ours?" William looked toward him before answering with complete honesty. "I am saying this engine was not built by someone trying to impress people." He turned back toward Daniel. "It was built by someone trying to solve problems." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. "That was always the goal." William rested one hand gently against the engine stand. "Do you know how many people spend 6 years building one engine this carefully?" Daniel answered quietly. "Probably not many." William nodded. "Almost none." He looked around at the employees gathered behind him. Only hours earlier many of them had quietly judged the mechanic by his worn work boots, faded truck, and oil-stained shirt. Now they stood completely silent before an engine they barely understood but instinctively respected because the one man whose opinion carried the greatest weight had recognized its craftsmanship immediately. William finally looked back at Daniel with a calm smile. "There is one final thing I would like to know." Daniel waited. "Would you allow me to hear it run?" The parking lot remained perfectly still as every person present realized they were about to witness something none of them had expected when an ordinary mechanic first walked through the dealership doors that morning. Daniel Carter looked at William Hawthorne for a quiet moment before giving a small nod. "I can do that." He carefully rolled the engine stand down from the back of the pickup and positioned it on the clean concrete beside the truck. Every movement reflected the same patience that had carried him through the entire afternoon. He checked each mounting point, tightened one support bracket by hand, and connected a compact external fuel system and battery that rested inside another storage case in the truck bed. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was performed for effect. The employees gathered around instinctively stepped back, giving him room to work. William watched every movement without speaking. He noticed Daniel checking simple details most people would overlook, confirming oil pressure by hand before connecting power, verifying clearances one final time, and inspecting every fitting with quiet discipline. Rebecca Lawson leaned toward one of her technicians and whispered, "He treats every bolt like it matters." William overheard her and smiled faintly. "That is because every bolt does matter." Daniel finally looked up. "Ready." William nodded once. Daniel reached toward the ignition switch mounted beside the engine stand and paused briefly, allowing the fuel system to stabilize before gently pressing the starter. The engine turned only twice before coming to life with a deep, controlled tone that immediately settled into an exceptionally smooth idle. It was powerful without sounding aggressive, refined without losing character. Instead of filling the parking lot with unnecessary noise, the engine produced a balanced mechanical rhythm that seemed almost effortless. Nobody spoke. William slowly closed his eyes for several seconds, listening exactly as Daniel had listened inside the showroom earlier that afternoon. The founder did not care about appearance. He listened for balance, timing, airflow, vibration, and mechanical harmony. When he finally opened his eyes again, there was unmistakable admiration in his expression. "Do you hear it?" he quietly asked the technician standing behind him. Several exchanged uncertain glances. One finally admitted, "It sounds smooth." William nodded gently. "Much more than smooth." He pointed toward the running engine. "Listen to how evenly every cylinder contributes. Listen to the absence of unnecessary vibration. Listen to how naturally the engine breathes instead of fighting itself." The technicians grew silent again, this time concentrating instead of assuming. Daniel lightly increased the engine speed before allowing it to return to idle. The transition was immediate, clean, and perfectly controlled. William smiled. "That throttle response tells me everything." One senior technician stepped forward, unable to hide his curiosity. "How did you develop something like this without a manufacturer behind you?" Daniel looked at the engine for a moment before answering. "One improvement at a time." William quietly laughed. "That is exactly how every great engine has ever been created." He slowly walked around the stand once more before stopping beside Daniel. "Most people build engines by following manuals." He looked toward the assembled employees. "This man built one by understanding principles." Every person standing nearby recognized the difference in those words. They were not compliments offered out of kindness. They were professional conclusions reached by someone whose entire career had been devoted to engineering excellence. The young salesman who had first directed Daniel toward the service entrance lowered his eyes with visible embarrassment. Rebecca noticed but said nothing. The lesson no longer required explanation. William rested one hand lightly on the engine stand before looking directly at Daniel. "Years ago, when I built my first prototype, I hoped someone older would recognize the work instead of judging the clothes of the person who built it." He smiled warmly. "Today, I finally had the chance to become that person for someone else." The parking lot remained completely silent. The same mechanic who had walked into the dealership carrying a worn wooden crate now stood surrounded by people who no longer saw his work boots, his faded pickup, or his stained work shirt. For the first time that day, they saw only the craftsman standing quietly behind the engine he had built with his own hands. William Hawthorne allowed the engine to idle for another minute before Daniel Carter gently switched it off. The sudden silence felt almost as powerful as the sound that had filled the parking lot only moments earlier. Nobody hurried to speak. The employees simply stood there, absorbing what they had witnessed. William slowly walked around the engine one final time before turning toward the group gathered behind him. "There is something every engineer eventually learns," he said calmly. "Machines never care about the reputation of the person holding the wrench. They only respond to knowledge, patience, and precision." His words settled over the crowd with quiet authority. The same technicians who had questioned Daniel earlier now looked at the hand-built engine with genuine admiration. Rebecca Lawson stepped forward first. "Mr. Carter," she said sincerely, "I owe you an apology. We judged you before we understood who you were." Daniel offered a small smile. "You judged what you could see. That happens every day." One of the younger technicians took a hesitant step forward. "Would you mind explaining how you reshaped the intake runners?" Daniel looked at him for a moment before answering. Only if you want to understand the reason instead of copying the shape. The technician nodded immediately. I do. Daniel smiled slightly. Then it is worth explaining. William quietly watched the exchange. More than the engine itself, this was what impressed him most. Daniel had every opportunity to embarrass the people who had laughed at him. Instead, he answered every question with patience. There was no bitterness in his voice. No desire to prove anyone wrong. Only a willingness to share what years of careful work had taught him. William finally spoke again. This company was founded by people who believed craftsmanship deserves respect no matter where it comes from. He paused before looking directly at the dealership staff. Today we nearly forgot that principle. Nobody argued. Nobody looked away. They all understood exactly what he meant. William turned back toward Daniel. I would like to extend a personal invitation. Come visit our engineering center. Meet our development team. I believe they would learn as much from you as you might learn from them. Several employees looked surprised by the invitation. Daniel remained thoughtful for a few moments before answering. I would be honored to visit. William smiled warmly. That is all I hoped you would say. Before closing the tailgate, Daniel carefully covered the engine with the same protective canvas he had removed earlier. One technician noticed the gesture and asked quietly, after all these years, do you still worry someone might damage it? Daniel adjusted one corner of the cover before replying. I protect it because of the years inside it, not because of the metal itself. William nodded with visible appreciation. That answer tells me everything I needed to know. A photographer who had arrived with the corporate team asked whether Daniel and William would stand together beside the engine for a picture. Daniel looked toward William, who simply smiled and said, only if the engine stands between us. It is the real reason we met today. They quietly agreed. As the camera captured the moment, nobody saw a wealthy founder standing beside a poor mechanic anymore. They saw two craftsmen connected by the same respect for honest work. The lesson spread quietly through the dealership long after the photograph was taken, reminding everyone present that true excellence often arrives without expensive clothes, impressive titles, or polished introductions, and only those willing to look beyond appearances ever have the privilege of recognizing it. The afternoon sun settled lower as Daniel Carter secured the final latch on the tailgate of his old pickup. Around him, the dealership parking lot looked exactly as it had only a few hours earlier. Luxury cars still reflected the golden light. Customers still wandered through the showroom. Sales consultants still greeted new arrivals with polished confidence. Yet something invisible had changed. William Hawthorne extended his hand once more before Daniel climbed into the driver's seat. When you visit our engineering center, he said warmly, come as yourself. Do not change a single thing. Daniel accepted the handshake with quiet gratitude. I never planned to. William smiled. I was hoping you would say that. Rebecca Lawson stepped forward holding the small package that Daniel had originally come to collect. During everything that had happened, everyone had forgotten the specialty bearing waiting behind the parts counter. She handed it to him with both hands. I believe this belongs to you. Daniel looked at the package, then laughed softly for the first time all day. I almost forgot why I came here. Several employees smiled with him. The tension that had filled the dealership earlier had disappeared completely. One by one, the technicians approached Daniel, not to congratulate him, but to thank him. The youngest among them spoke first. I learned more in one afternoon than I expected to learn this month. Daniel nodded respectfully. Keep listening to the machines. They are patient teachers. Another technician asked whether he could someday visit Daniel's small repair shop. Daniel answered with the same humility he had shown from the beginning. The coffee is simple, but the garage door is always open. Even the young valet who had directed him toward the service entrance walked over quietly. He looked uncomfortable for a moment before speaking. I judged you before I even knew your name." Daniel looked at him with calm understanding. "Then tomorrow you have another chance to meet someone without making the same mistake." The young man smiled with visible relief. William watched every conversation in silence. More than the remarkable engine, more than the flawless craftsmanship, this was what convinced him he had met an extraordinary builder. Talent could create remarkable machines. Character created remarkable people. As Daniel started the old pickup, its familiar engine rumbled to life with the same honest sound that had carried him to work for years. Nobody laughed now. Employees naturally stepped aside as he slowly drove toward the dealership exit. Several customers who had witnessed the afternoon quietly nodded in respect as he passed. Daniel acknowledged each one with the same small wave. No celebration followed him. No cameras surrounded him. No dramatic speech marked his departure. The greatest victory of the day required none of those things. William remained standing near the entrance until the faded pickup disappeared beyond the intersection. Rebecca joined him quietly. "Do you think we will see him again?" William kept his eyes on the empty road for another moment before answering. "I certainly hope so." He smiled thoughtfully. People like Daniel remind an entire industry why it exists. Weeks later, engineers at the Hawthorne Development Center would still be discussing the hand-built engine they had finally examined in detail. They admired its precision, its elegant solutions, and the years of patient craftsmanship hidden within every component. Yet when William spoke about that afternoon, he rarely mentioned the engine first. Instead, he remembered the quiet mechanic who walked into a luxury dealership wearing worn work boots, carrying nothing more than a wooden crate and the confidence earned through honest work. The engine earned everyone's admiration, but the man who built it earned something far more valuable: respect. And in the end, that was the only recognition Daniel had ever been searching for.